Well, welcome everyone to our cottage meeting for this week, Moms for America. My name is Julene Jackson, and I'm the National Vice President over cottage meetings. And the whole premise behind Moms for America is that liberty begins at home. How are our children going to know to love and revere this land, to perpetuate what our founders gave us, if they're not being taught? And they're mostly going to be taught these ideals within the four walls of our home. This is why it's so important that mamas and grandmas know and understand the miracles of America and the history and the stories of this great land. And so we come together once a week to kind of learn together, to share experiences and ideas and stories. And then we go home and we reteach it to the people that we love the most, our children. Maybe you're having conversations with your husbands, your grown children, you're telling them what you're doing. And so you will see how what we're learning will begin to have the ability to have interesting conversations and be able to kind of relate it to current events with the people that you love the most. So welcome everyone. Before we get started in our online cottage meeting, we always say a little prayer to invite the Spirit of God into our meeting, and then we pledge, and then we will get started on our lesson today, Raised Up for This Very Purpose. And Heather has volunteered. Thank you so much, Heather. Heather, where are you from?
Wyoming.
Wyoming. Okay.
Where it's cold.
And it's, I bet it is so cold. Well, I hope there's a fire going or the heat is cranked up and you have your bunny slippers.
I have a fireplace, wood fireplace, right across the room from me.
Oh my word. I wish we were all meeting in your home today for the cottage.
It's cozy.
So cozy. Okay, Heather will offer a prayer and then we'll say a pledge and then we'll get started on our class today. Thank you, Heather.
Our Father in heaven, we're grateful for this opportunity to meet as sisters from around the country, to learn more about your ways of freedom. And we're so grateful for those who have learned about this and learned more about the Constitution and are willing to share more with us. And we pray that we will each find the path that we are supposed to take individually and what truths we are supposed to know and share. And we ask that we can have the courage to share and to do what we need to do to learn of our missions. And we pray for the Spirit to be with us today as we learn, and we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Heather. Okay, if we could all stand, if you feel like standing. Here's our little flag, or you can look at the flag in Vivian's office. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We are going through a 16-week course on the healing of America. We're in our first manual, God's Hand in Building of America. And we had our very first lesson last week entitled The Events and the People Who Prepared the Way for Freedom. We are on section 2 today, entitled Raised Up for This Very Purpose. I hope that over the course of last week, you were able to share with your children and husband and people you love the story of Joan of Arc and how Joan of Arc saved France. And because she saved France, 350 years later saved us at the Battle of Yorktown. Or tell the story of Christopher Columbus being inspired by God to come to this land and to bring the knowledge of God to this new world. And then the beautiful pilgrims who came here under covenant. They felt that if God would take them to this new land and colonize and bring God here, that God would do his part of the covenant, and protect them and ensure that, this land take root. And so all last week, each morning in my little devotional with my 13-year-old, while she's eating her little cereal before school, I will open up this manual and I'll read a little story. And I just read to her, we talked about Thomas Jefferson, and that is one of the figures that we're going to discuss today. And so this takes us, now remember, our coursework is fill in the blank, and the whole brilliance behind fill in the blank is something that you have to actually fill in. You retain more. And if you actually use cursive script there's an emotional connection as you're writing, and you remember it even to a greater degree. And so hopefully you're able every day as a part of your Liberty study is to do a few pages of this fill in the blank. So when you come to us on Wednesday, you've filled in the blank, you kind of, you're mulling around this story, and then we'll kind of give you an overview over the 45 minutes. If we were actually to fill in and go through the entire material like you might do if you had an in-home cottage meeting, it probably would take you about 2 hours per section. But I kind of give you an overview as we flow through it on our online cottage meeting within a 45-minute span. And so we're on section 2 today. And like Vivian said, if for some reason you ever miss a class, within 48 hours, it's up on our momsforamerica.us website, and you can view that presentation on YouTube. So here we go, ladies. Let's get started. Raised up for this very purpose. It's about 1760 now. It's been about 120 years since the Pilgrim landed, and about 1 out of every 4 English people were coming to America, were migrating over the course of those 120 years. And the eastern seaboard was filling up now, full of English people. And King George is still the king. He's overseeing all these little colonies across the ocean. There's about 3 million of English colonists that are now in the Americas. King George III was a popular, and he was known to be a good king. He had 15 children. And later on in life, he actually went insane. And some people think maybe that was the reason he went insane, those 15 kids. But he started off, he was a good moral man, but he was having a hard time now, kind of controlling 3 million of these colonists that didn't know him from Adam. They had been born and raised in this new world, and they didn't like some of the taxes and some of the things that he was imposing on them. He didn't want them in the 1760s to buy goods from foreign countries. He kind of wanted to, keep the money at home, so to speak, buy only English goods. And so what happened is the colonists began to smuggle as they would purchase things from foreign countries. And then when they would get caught, there was no jury, so there wasn't fair convictions. And the king passed a writs of assistance, meaning that at any time a soldier could come in and search for any of these smuggled goods. And so the colonists were having to put up with some things that made them very uncomfortable. And in fact, King George said that the colonists couldn't settle beyond the mountains into the Ohio Valley, and some of the colonists already had done that. So there was some resentment that was growing towards the crown and England. And then in the 1765, have you heard of the Stamp Act? It was a tax on magazines and papers that the colonists were having to pay to England. And of course, they had no representation in Parliament. So they were being taxed, but they didn't have any voice back home in England. And so you can see with these various acts that the king was imposing. He imposed the Townshend Act, which was another tax on glass and lead and tea and paint during this time period. And he also imposed the Quartering Act, which meant that British soldiers could be housed and fed in the American homes free of charge. So imagine that, if some soldiers just showed up at your house and said, we are moving in and what time is dinner, kind of thing. And so you can see during this period of 1760s, 1770s, it was just, the situation was kind of ripe for an eruption of violence. And violence indeed is what happened in 1770. Remember the Boston Massacre in Boston. There was about 16,000 colonists living in Boston at that time, about 2,000 British soldiers. And it was a cold, wintry day, and there was about 300 young boys and men in downtown Boston, and there were soldiers all throughout the city, and they were harassing each other. And some of the colonists began to lob snowballs and objects at the soldiers, and one of the soldiers got hit, so he fired, and then there was a massacre, and 5 colonists end up dying. And through that event, there was all kind of depictions and reports and propaganda that only heightened the tensions that were being felt now for several years throughout those 13 colonists. Kind of reminds me of today. Events going on and people that were there kind of know what happened, but the way it's being depicted or reported is maybe being misrepresented. I'm kind of thinking of the January 6th rally that President Trump had at the White House and how there's been so many misrepresentations of that. But anyway, so these are the kind of things that were going on. And then just a few years later, in 1773, we have the Boston Tea Party, where the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams, dress up as Indians, and they go aboard this English ship in the harbor of Boston and tip over all the English tea with all the taxes that they were going to have to pay on it. I don't know if you know anything about Samuel Adams. He was really known as the father of the American Revolution. He was like the ultimate freedom fighter and patriot. He was actually, Samuel Adams was the second cousin to John Adams, who was a great patriot and obviously the second president of the United States. But he and these Sons of Liberty were real provocateurs and patriots, and they used civil disobedience to kind of intimidate some of the loyalists at that time and to outrage and agitate the British government. And so all this kind of action led to 1774, the First Continental Congress, this voluntary Congress, and each colony sent some representatives because they knew that they were on the verge of war and they were determined to stand up for their rights, but they weren't quite sure how this was going to look. And sure enough, a new nation was about to be born. You have Samuel Adams, like I said, he was really at the front of every major development in the birth of the American nation. I'm on page 41 of my manual. And this is why he's called the father of the American independence. And he was the first to have a price put on his head, as British officials initially tried to bribe him with gold and high offices to kind of stand down and stop this, but he wouldn't. And so there was a 500-pound reward for anyone that would capture Samuel Adams. These were very dangerous times to be alive for these leaders. Certainly, they were going against King George at the peril of their own life and would have a gruesome death if they were caught. And so during this 12-month period, really, you began to see a shift of loyalty now from I'm an Englishman to now I'm an American. And for 15 years, these little colonists had really had to put up with the abuses of England. And it even says in the Declaration of Independence that we're going to talk about that at every stage of our oppression, we have petitioned the government, but we have just continued to be met with repeated injuries. And that's how they felt over the course of these 15 years. They would send letters and petitions over to England, and they were largely ignored. And so in 1775, the shot heard around the world. Does that sound familiar? In Lexington and Concord, killing over 95, wounding or killing 95 Americans. And that really was kind of what began the Revolutionary War that was ultimately going to lead to the creation of America. And we get that wonderful story of Paul Revere and the night ride and putting the lanterns in the North Church, 2 lanterns if they were British were coming by sea, 1 lantern if they were coming by land. And it's a wonderful story to talk about with your children. And that occurred with that Battle of Lexington. And then a few months later was the Battle of Bunker Hill. And that was really the first real battle where over 500 Americans were wounded or killed, and the British lost over 1,000. And I think at this point it proved to the British that the colonists were indeed serious foes. And so just a month later, in July of 1775, our wonderful General George Washington takes the helm of the Continental Army. And then the next month, King George issues a proclamation of complete general rebellion is going on in those colonies. And he says, these rebel leaders, if they're caught, they will be arrested as traitors and brought to justice, which meant that they would be executed. They would be hung, and then they would hung until they're unconscious, and then they would be brought down and revived. They would be disemboweled. Their parts would be cut up and they would be buried around the area. It would be gruesome if they were to be caught, and these men knew that at this point. And so in December of 1775, the king was now treating all Americans as if they were the enemies. The American ships were being seized, their cargoes were being confiscated, and the colonists knew that they could not tolerate this anymore. Which takes us then to that fateful year of 1776. Now, we think of 1776 as just a glorious year in the history of American heritage, American history. But mamas, it wasn't glorious at all to be living at that time, and certainly not for the founding families, knowing the fear that they were living with each day, with what they were courageously doing. And in fact, some of them considered this one of the worst years in this very formative time of American history. Canada, and as I think about that, oftentimes in our life, sometimes we'll say, this is a bad month, or we've even had this is a bad year. Sometimes I'm 52, I'm like, that was a bad decade. But imagine, as they look back at this time, and it was a difficult year, but look at all the transformation and good that came from some of our lowest, darkest points in our life. And I certainly look at events in my life and years that have been particularly trying, and actually I have learned the most. I've learned my greatest lessons during these dark times. And this is how these founders felt. But from this was going to become, the new nation was going to be born in 1776. So what was going on? Some of the soldiers were up in Canada and were being defeated. So they came down and met up with George Washington after the siege on Boston in 1776. And there was about 4,000 of Washington's troops that were going to leave him. And those that were with him many of them were sick. And the enlistments of a lot of these soldiers only lasted 6 months. And oftentimes they didn't re-enlist after the 6 months because there really wasn't a lot of means to support or pay. There wasn't, oftentimes the conditions were freezing. They didn't have shoes. And so morale was low. The American colonies had been completely disowned by King George III. And the leaders of these colonies recognized that these circumstances now that would cause them to be separated from British rule, that these colonies had no idea how to govern themselves. And so in 1776, the leaders of these colonies came together. And they were all kind of looking to Virginia at this time, because Virginia was the largest in population of all the colonies. And so they looked to them for leadership, how to best form this new independent government. So here we are, there's going to be a meeting of all the leaders of the colonists to try and figure out, how we declare our independence. And they were looking to Virginia to kind of lead the way in discovering the best form of government. And now that Virginia had already come up with 6 different types of drafts for a practical constitution. And Thomas Jefferson, he was 33 years old at this time. He'd only been married about 4 years to his Martha. And he was really the foremost constitutionalist, they say, even in the world. So you're going to see how God really prepared him and put him in this place to do what he was going to do now in history. Jefferson himself had written 3 constitutional drafts for the Virginia over a course of 5 weeks, but all of these drafts had been rejected by the Virginia legislature. And that was frustrating to Thomas Jefferson, because what Virginia actually did during this period is they kind of adopted a temporary constitution for their colony that retained much of the weaknesses of the under the British rule. And so he was frustrated because he's thinking, look, that's the very reason why we're fighting. We're fighting against some of these old ways and traditions and customs. And so Thomas Jefferson, we're gonna read about the genius of Thomas Jefferson's plan. In 1776, he'd already kind of discovered through his study the basic success of formulation that he was going to incorporate eventually into the Constitution of the United States. But it was going to be hard to try and convince the people of some of these ideas, but he was best prepared to do what he was going to do. If any of you have ever studied Thomas Jefferson, we love him in our family. At a young age, he studied Latin and Greek and French, and he ultimately knew 5 languages. And at age 16, he entered into the College of William and Mary that was founded in 1692, one of the oldest universities to exist in America, still exists today, the School of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Colonial Williamsburg, Virginia. I actually, a few years ago, our family lived there for a year, just like down the street from William and Mary, right in the Colonial Williamsburg. It was just heavenly to live there. And they've recreated Colonial Williamsburg. And I would often walk on the campus and imagine what it must have been like for Thomas Jefferson. He was educated at William and Mary for several years. And then he went on to be taught by George Wythe. George Wythe was the first law professor in the United States, and the George Wythe House is still there at Colonial Williamsburg. It was one of the few houses that the foundation was intact, and they have rebuilt it. And that is my favorite house in Colonial Williamsburg, the George Wythe home. And it's got bright colors and wallpaper, and you go into the room that Thomas Jefferson was taught by George Wythe, and there's such a spirit of that home. And I love it. Put that on your bucket list to take your children or grandchildren to Colonial Williamsburg and to the College of William and Mary, where Thomas Jefferson was educated, and to the George Wythe home, where he was taught law. You know, during that 5-year period, Thomas Jefferson studied 12 to 14 hours a day. And oftentimes I read years ago that he would take long walks or even run every day to take a break, 2 to 3 miles a day. And he would memorize when he would go out on his walks. And when I learned that several years ago in my cottage meeting, I began to memorize things when I would take the dogs for a walk or when I go jogging. And I ultimately memorized certain sections of the Declaration of Independence, the 27 amendments, the 7 articles, even the 28 principles. In the 5,000-year leap, I memorized on my walks because of the example of Thomas Jefferson during that intensive period in his life where he studied 12 to 14 hours. It was as if God was preparing him for the magnitude of what he was going to do. He was going to be the author of the Declaration of Independence. And so he not only studied languages, he would study history. He carefully studied the Old and New Testament. And it was there, as he studied the books of Exodus and Deuteronomy and Numbers, that he discovered the ancient principles, the first government, a representative government by Moses. And Moses would have these families of 10s and 50s and hundreds and thousands. And the local problems were handled closest to the people at the local level, and only the big problems ever made it to Moses. And so Thomas Jefferson saw this form of representative government as he studied the scriptures. And as Thomas Jefferson also studied the English history and the Anglo-Saxons. And remember, we talked about last week, the Anglo-Saxons were believed to be descendants of some of the lost tribes of Israel that fled during the Babylonian and the Persian, conquest. And they fled up to the North, England, Norway, Sweden. And they retained these ancient principles that Moses had used to govern. clear up until the 8th century. These Anglo-Saxons were using these identical ancient principles that Moses used in the Bible. And Thomas Jefferson saw this, and he saw the connections. And he also was studying the great Magna Carta in 1215 from England, and those great documents of freedom, the Petition of Writs and the Bill of Rights and the Habeas Corpus. And Thomas Jefferson was going to weave these ideas and these phrases into the Declaration of Constitution through this intensive 5 years of study beforehand. And, you know, girls, oftentimes you're going to be inspired to learn and study certain things, and you won't really know why. And then at some point, the door will open and God will need that knowledge and that study that you have acquired. And then you will understand. But if you're feeling, obviously you're here on this call today, that you need to study some of these things that we are. And maybe you might not know really what's going to come of it, but just trust it. Study together, learn these things. And I promise you that God will use you as an instrument to strengthen your family and your communities and your land because of the study that you're doing now. And so anyways, this was Thomas Jefferson. He was caught up in the spirit of independence of 1776. It was right at this time that Thomas Paine wrote that Common Sense that George Washington said, that little Common Sense pamphlet really was what worked a powerful change in the might in the hearts of men at this time. Over 120,000 copies of Common Sense were sold at that time in 1776. That would be equivalent today of about 13 million books being sold. It would be a bestseller. And Thomas Paine also in 1776 wrote that wonderful paper right before Washington crossed on Christmas night. I'll tell you about that next week, where Thomas Paine says, "These are the times that try men's souls. We don't need summer soldiers or sunshine patriots." And I almost feel as I study history, I'm like, gosh, this sounds like today. You know, we've got to just rise up and have courage and not just sink back into apathy or to a Netflix movie, but to study, to be doing, to be learning, to be about, you know, preparing ourselves for what might come in the future in this country. And so all the representatives from the different colonies meet in May of 1776 in Philadelphia, and trying to figure out, to decide what kind of, you know, government we should have, a free people. And Thomas Jefferson instinctively knew that we were going to win this war and that we would be free. And Thomas Jefferson feared that we might not know what to do with our freedom once we got it. And this is why he was so concerned that Virginia's Constitution be an example and a model to the other states when that time would come. You know, Thomas Jefferson almost missed his opportunity to write the Declaration of Independence, because during that spring and summer of 1776, he requested to go back home to his state of Virginia. Now they're all in Philadelphia at this point. He wanted to go back home because it was weighing on his mind that they were not getting this Constitution right in Virginia. And mostly it was a trying year for him. I mean, when it rains, it floods sometimes in our life. His little girl had just died. His wife was so sick in Monticello. His mother had just died in March. His heart was heavy. And oftentimes when we're called to do really important things, our heart is heavy, and we really have to just dig deep and draw closer to the Lord. And he had terrible headaches for this 5-week period. So he was secluded in a room in Philadelphia, and there he wrote 17 days, the Declaration of Independence. And he'd have these headaches during the day, and he would take breaks playing the violin to kind of soothe his little soul. And people have written that they would hear Thomas Jefferson late at night playing the violin, maybe to soothe his heart and his worry that he had over, this country and his family. And there's an interesting conversation that he and John Adams have about who should write the Declaration. John Adams said, you should do it. And Jefferson said, no, you should do it, John. Adams said, "You're a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. And besides, I'm obnoxious and unpopular, and you're not. And you're 10 times a better writer than I am." And so that is how Thomas Jefferson got the assignment to write the Declaration. It took him 17 days. It only took 1 day to write most of the Declaration of Constitution, because it was basically just grievances that the colonists had against England. And he had already made those grievances up in drafts of the Constitution. But it took 16 days to write the first really two paragraphs. And that is where he was gleaning from Scripture, Moses's ancient principles. And if you go and you read those two paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence, there's about 8 ancient principles that are woven in. And Thomas Jefferson actually said that he felt these principles would be eternal principles. And so no doubt he was probably feeling the magnitude of what he was compiling here, that maybe these laws, these principles would go on to govern, who knows, into the millennium. And so it took him 17 days total to write the Declaration of Independence. You know, Thomas Jefferson is a really interesting study. He built this beautiful Monticello home. I don't know if any of you have had a chance to go to Monticello. It exists today. It's near Charlottesville, Virginia, where the University of Virginia is. And when Thomas Jefferson died, he said, "I just want to be known by 3 things. I want 3 things on my tombstone." It's a beautiful obelisk at Monticello. He said, "I want to be put, I was the author of the Declaration of Independence, that I was the author of the Statute of Virginia for religious freedoms. Don't you let anyone say that Thomas Jefferson was not a God-fearing man who understood the importance of God and religion in maintaining this country." He's written a beautiful book. There's a book called the Jefferson Bible. He actually cut and pasted, when he was alive, all the excerpts of Jesus speaking, and he made a little cut and paste Bible. And there was a column in Latin, another column in Greek, another column in French, and then an English column. And he kept the words of Jesus next to in his pocket, next to his heart. It's a wonderful book. I would highly recommend. It's called the Jefferson Bible. So he wanted to be known as the author of the Declaration of Independence on his tombstone, the author of the Virginia for Religious Freedoms, and also the father of the University of Virginia. So he actually married his little Martha. He was 29, she was 24. Little Martha had been married before, but her husband had died. They had a child. That child lived to be 3, and then that little child died. And then she married Thomas Jefferson, and they had 6 children. 4 of the 6 were going to die. So only 2 of his children lived to adulthood. He and Martha would only have 10 years together. She would die at the age of 33, and he never remarried. They had a great deep affection, and he said he would never marry. His heart was broken. He loved his Martha. She said the thing she loved about him is his music. He would play the violin, and she was a piano player. And he got her a piano, and it is in Monticello. If you go to Monticello, you can see that piano to this day. Now, Thomas Jefferson he inherited slaves, and he had about 600 slaves at the time of his death. And there's a lot of controversy about that. And he was under obligation to the bank for these slaves. So it's not like these founders could just let go their slaves. They'd have to pay for them, and they didn't have the means to do that. There's a wonderful book. There's many books out that debunk this myth that Thomas Jefferson would have illegitimate children with young slave Sally Heming. There's a really good book called The Real Thomas Jefferson that sets the record straight. It was the nephew of Thomas Jefferson that everyone knew was fathering these slaves, but the DNA just said it was Jefferson blood. And so they, the enemies of our founders wanted to point and say it was Thomas Jefferson. And this idea came out during the Clinton years when Clinton was having problems with Monica Lewinsky. So if they could kind of debase and tear apart the integrity of our founding fathers, maybe what Clinton was doing wouldn't have been so bad. So it's interesting, all that Sally Hemings came out at that time that Clinton was having his problems. But anyone in that day knew that it wasn't Thomas Jefferson that was fathering these children, that it was the nephew that was known to hang out in the slave quarters. And so get this book, and it kind of debunks some of the story that now has been so entrenched and perpetuated against Thomas Jefferson. Every time we go to Monticello, we get to Thomas Jefferson's room, and the tour guide then brings up Sally Heming and his illegitimate mulatto children. And my husband always raises his hand and says, I would like to tell another side of the story. And so I always can anticipate that will come up when we go to Monticello. For those that want to have a little bit more understanding of this, there's a wonderful 1-hour presentation if you go to the thomasjeffersoncenter.com website. And when you pull it up, the Thomas Jefferson Center, and they're the ones that have written these Healing of America seminars, it's almost one of the first things on their website, a real handsome Black man, and it's entitled Slavery and the Founding Fathers. He gives a presentation called Slavery and the Founding Fathers, Dispelling the Smear Job Waged Against Our Founding Fathers. And it's a 1-hour presentation, and it's so good. And that man happens to be my husband. And so I would really recommend watching that if you want. Remember, it was me that kind of woke him up to this freedom cause. He thought I was a right-wing radical when I started teaching, some of these ideas to our children in our devotional. And now he's woke up. He's right next to me in this freedom fight. And so I really would recommend that to kind of set the record straight about some of the rumors and the false myths surrounding Thomas Jefferson. And so here we have it. Out of all the changes that were made when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, not one change was made to those ancient principles in those first 2 paragraphs. There was about 60 changes made, but not a single change to the ancient principles that Thomas Jefferson wove in to the Declaration. And so ultimately copies were made once the Declaration was written by Jefferson, and the signers, there was 56 signers, and John Hancock signed his name especially big, kind of some say as a dig to the King of England, so that he wouldn't need to see his glasses to see that John Hancock was one of those signers. And really, these men signed away with really their blood in support of this declaration, as they pledged. The very last line of the Declaration says, we do this as we pledge to each other, literally our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honors, as they did so. And so after the the Declaration was written, Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams were asked to form a little committee to prepare an official seal for the United States. And this seal ultimately would be what would go on the money, on passports, on treaties, and it would ultimately be the seal for the President of the United States. And these men wanted the seal to be portraying Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt, because they were the first to kind of practice this first form of representative government. And then on the other side of the seal, John Adams knew that Jefferson had discovered that the Anglo-Saxons used the identical ancient principles that Moses used. So they wanted the Anglo-Saxon chiefs Henge and Horsa to be depicted. Do you see that on the last page of section 2 for that to be our seal? And Congress thought that was a little too complicated. So they just came up with the eagle that we have today, that plurum annum out of many colonies becomes one nation. And then on the other side of that seal is the unfinished, do you see that? Unfinished pyramid with 13 steps, which symbolize the 13 colonies and more to come, with the eye of the all-seeing, knowing creator right there overseeing it. And then those little statements in Latin, the top one says, "He hath favored our undertaking." They knew that they were a remnant of Israel and that they would be entitled to the protection and covenant of God if they looked to him. And then there at the bottom, the beginning of a new age. And so that would be our seal for that would take us into where we are now. So I hope mamas and grandmothers, you're beginning to see how God used, little Joan of Arc in 1425 to save France, which saved America, and Christopher Columbus to discover this new world, and then our pilgrims to, make a covenant with God that they would bring God to this new land and raise their children in his ways, and God would protect them, and how God used the courage and the fighting spirit of Samuel Adams, and then the genius, the brilliance, the intellect of Thomas Jefferson to write this great document, which he felt was going to have eternal principles that would carry us on into the eternities. And as this eastern seaboard now is being populated of a population of 3 million in 1776, which is going to take us to that fateful year where they declare their independence and the Revolutionary War begins, with little farmers and young boys and old men and unskilled laborers as they join our great General Washington. I can't even hardly say General Washington without feeling emotional, as I've studied him through the years. And he is one of our heroes in our family. And you will feel that too as you study him and you understand the weight that was on his shoulders and what he did. And we'll study some of the battles next week. It's only 5 pages. Our homework assignment is small for next week. And we're going to discover some of these miracles during this Revolutionary War. As you study these men and these women, I think that you will feel an awe and reverence come over you as you understand the sacrifice and the courage and everything they put on the line for what they did. And they did it because they felt the divine hand of providence leading them. Thomas Jefferson mentions God over 6 times. He wove God and nature's God into that document. And they knew that God was upholding them. And it's just as it is, I hope, with us as we move forward at this time of such great unrest and uncertainty and division and hate and anger, that God will be with us. And, we seek to heal this land, to heal our communities, and to heal relationships with neighbors. And even within families, there's division, maybe marriages or children, that God has promised. Remember in 2 Chronicles 7:14, that as we seek his face and we turn to him, he will help heal this land. And I believe that as we turn to him, we will justify the heavens to intervene on our behalf as we look to him and know that our solutions don't come from President Biden or even former President Trump or Washington, D.C. It's turning to God. That is where real deliverance and help and inspiration will come. And as we make our family time a high priority, and as we get right our relationships within our family, I have a boy who's 22 years old and he's in the NBA. He plays for the Detroit Pistons. He's been an NBA player for a few years. And about a month ago, I had a very difficult conversation with him as a mother. Sometimes we're inspired to rise up and say certain things to our children and even grown children who have left the home. And I said some things to him that he did not like, and it was hard for him to hear. And he just said, "Mom, I just need some space." And so meaning, "I don't want to talk to you for a while, Mom." And I still texted him, but I picked up the phone and I called him last night, and we talked for over an hour, and he told me all about, he was traded to Detroit recently. So he's going through a transition in his life. He was a New Orleans Pelicans and now he's a Detroit Piston. And he told me all about that. And I ultimately ended up saying, sweetheart, I'm so sorry for the conversation that we had a few weeks ago. I know you didn't like some of the things I said to you. And I said, honey, when I say these things, it's just out of love. Mom and dad love you and we're worried about you. And it was so sweet. He said, Mom, I know that. And I was able to heal that relationship. And this is what we have to do. If there's some divisions in some of our relationships, we need to make it a priority to get those relationships right. And then as we begin to study the Constitution and the miracles of America from the viewpoint of those that actually live there, as we do these three things, then God will inspire us what we can do now to begin to heal this land and what we can do out in our communities and what organizations that we can join. And you've joined this online cottage meeting, and ultimately you might be inspired after the end of these 16 weeks to join with a few moms in your neighborhood or like-minded mothers and friends that are worried, and you can begin to have classes in your home. I have seen the difference that it's made in my life, and I know the difference that it'll make in yours, and hopefully some of the things that you're learning in our online cottage meeting as well, will begin to place certain ideas and thoughts in your heart and minds about how you can go about healing your home and your neighborhoods and communities. When people are ignorant, you take ignorance when you're not educated. When you take ignorance and you add fear to that, then you have hate. And that's what we see so much now with people that are being activists. You think of some of the Antifas or even some of the BLM or, some of these groups that are activating when you don't really have an education and understand how this nation was formed and how God was involved. When you have education, you have hope. And when you have education and hope, you're so much more productive about bringing forth real change for the better. And so I just have to really commend you girls for coming and learning and studying together each week and studying on your own throughout the week. So having said that, we've come to the end of our class today. I'm so glad you're with us. Next week, we will be on section 3, the war that made them free. The war that set them free. And it's only 5 pages. It's a little bit smaller section next week. Remember, for some reason you miss one of these classes, you can find it online at our website and you can view the presentation. It takes 48 hours for these classes to come up. Please invite your friends and family. These classes are free. They can very easily get caught up. And it will be a wonderful experience, hopefully, for them. And so we love all of you out there. Please stay on if you have any questions about anything we've talked about today or any aspect of the cottage meeting. But if not, we will sign off and we will see you next week, same time, same place, 11 a.m. next Wednesday. Thank you so much, mamas, sisters, grandmas. We're doing